Welcome, everyone. Please leave a like, subscribe, activate notifications, and enjoy this story. In the bustling heart of New York City, where towering skyscrapers cast long shadows and power is wielded behind closed boardroom doors, a seemingly insignificant moment can shift everything. Evelyn, a modest janitor, has spent years blending into the background, unnoticed and unappreciated. But today, amidst the city's elite, she finds herself at the center of a high-stakes meeting. As the tension rises and the atmosphere thickens with expectation, Evelyn faces a choice that could change her life forever. One small decision, one brave act, and suddenly the future of more than just her own destiny is at stake. What happens next will leave everyone, including Evelyn, questioning everything they thought they knew about power, bravery, and the value of a single voice. In the heart of Manhattan, where skyscrapers reached for the clouds and dreams were made and shattered daily, Evelyn Lewis quietly maneuvered her cleaning cart through the expansive hallways of Vanguard Enterprises. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting long shadows as she made her way toward the main conference room. It was 7:30 a.m., and the building was already abuzz with anticipation. Evelyn's weathered hands, hardened from years of scrubbing and polishing, gripped the handle of her cart tightly. At 52, she moved with purpose, her petite frame belying the strength within. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her uniform, though clean and pressed, had seen better days. As she approached the conference room, raised voices caught her attention through the glass walls. She could see Thomas Blackwell, the CEO of Vanguard Enterprises, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. His tailored suit did little to conceal the tension in his shoulders, and his face was flushed with frustration. "I don't care what it takes. These numbers need to be flawless." Thomas's voice boomed, causing his assistants to flinch. "The investors will be here in an hour, and everything has to be perfect. Do you understand?" Evelyn lowered her gaze and slipped into the room, trying to remain unnoticed as she always did. She began her routine, wiping down surfaces and emptying trash bins, while the chaos of last-minute preparations swirled around her. Her mind drifted to her modest apartment in Brooklyn, where her two children, Emma and Jack, were likely just waking up. She had left before dawn, as usual, leaving a hastily scribbled note promising to be home for dinner. The guilt of another missed breakfast gnawed at her, but she set it aside. This job, though demeaning, was their lifeline. Suddenly, a commotion near the main screen drew her attention. Thomas was angrily gesticulating at a series of graphs and charts projected on the wall. "These projections are all wrong. How am I supposed to convince the board with this mess?" he roared, his face turning an alarming shade of red. Evelyn couldn't help but glance at the screen. Numbers had always been her passion, a remnant of her past life as a math professor in Columbia before violence shattered her world, forcing her to flee with nothing but her children and the clothes on their backs. As her eyes scanned the data, something seemed off. The growth projection appeared inflated beyond what the actual numbers could support. It was a subtle error, one that most would miss, but to Evelyn, it stood out like a glaring mistake on a classroom chalkboard. Her heart began to race. Should she say something? The rational part of her urged her to stay silent, to remain invisible. But another voice, reminiscent of her younger self, urged her to speak up. Evelyn took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she set down her cleaning cloth. "Excuse me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to the small woman in the janitor's uniform. Thomas's gaze was particularly intense, a mix of surprise and irritation crossing his face. "What is it?" he snapped, impatience dripping from every word. Evelyn swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry. "The numbers," she stammered, her accent thickening with nervousness. "They're not correct." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Thomas's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Excuse me?" he said, his voice low and threatening. Evelyn felt her knees weaken, but she pressed on. "The growth projections," she explained, pointing at the screen with a trembling finger. "They're overstated by at least 15%. If you look at the baseline data and apply the correct formula." As Thomas approached her, his face a mask of fury, Evelyn flinched, memories of past violence flashing through her mind. But then something unexpected happened. Thomas's eyes darted to the screen, then back to Evelyn, his brow furrowing as he mentally recalculated the figures. The silence in the room was deafening. Evelyn could hear her own heart pounding in her ears, feeling the weight of every stare boring into her. She silently prayed not for herself, but for her children. What would happen to them if she lost this job? After what felt like an eternity, Thomas spoke. "She's right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, then louder. "She's right. How did we miss this?" The room erupted into chaos. Assistants scrambled to correct the data, phones rang as people were called in to help, and through it all, Evelyn stood rooted to the spot, unable to believe what had just happened. Thomas turned to her, his expression unreadable. "What's your name?" he asked. "Evelyn Lewis," she replied, her voice shaking. He nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. "Evelyn Lewis," he repeated, as if committing it to memory. "I want you in my office at the end of the day. We need to talk." With that, he turned away, barking orders at his team to fix the presentation before the investors arrived. Evelyn felt the room spinning around her. What had she done? Would she be fired? Praised? The uncertainty was overwhelming. As she nimbly returned to her cleaning cart, Evelyn's mind raced with possibilities. She thought of her children, the bills piling up on her kitchen table, and the dreams she had long ago abandoned. For better or worse, she knew that this moment, this one act of courage, had set in motion a chain of events that would change her life forever. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Evelyn went through her usual routine, cleaning offices and restrooms, while her encounter with Thomas Blackwell replayed in her mind. As the sun began to set over the New York skyline, casting long shadows across the city, Evelyn found herself standing outside Thomas's office, her heart pounding in her chest. She raised a trembling hand to knock, wondering what fate awaited her behind that imposing oak door. Whatever happened next, Evelyn knew one thing for certain: her life would never be the same again. The setting sun bathed Thomas Blackwell's corner office in a warm golden glow. Evelyn stood just inside the doorway, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, trying to steady their trembling. The plush carpet beneath her feet felt alien after a day spent walking on cold tile floors. "Sit down, Mrs. Lewis," Thomas said, gesturing to a leather chair across from his imposing desk. His voice was calm, almost gentle, a stark contrast to the thunderous tone he'd used earlier. Evelyn perched on the edge of the seat, her back straight. She couldn't help but notice how out of place her worn uniform looked against the sleek, modern furnishings of the office. Thomas leaned back in his chair, studying her with piercing blue eyes. "You surprised me today," he began, his fingers steepled under his chin. "Not many people have the courage to speak up like that. Especially in front of a room full of executives." Evelyn swallowed hard, unsure if this was praise or a prelude to her dismissal. "I'm sorry if I overstepped, Mr. Blackwell. I just couldn't stay silent. When I saw the error—" A hint of a smile played at the corners of Thomas's mouth. "No, you saved us from a potential disaster with those investors. But what I want to know is, how did you spot that mistake? It wasn't exactly something—" He paused, searching for the right words. The implied question hung in the air between them. Evelyn felt a familiar ache in her chest, a pang from a past life that seemed increasingly distant with each passing day. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the story she was about to tell. "I was a professor," she said softly, her accent thickening with emotion. "In Colombia, I taught mathematics at the National University in Bogotá for over a decade." Thomas's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "A professor? How did you end up?" He gestured vaguely at her uniform. Evelyn's eyes clouded with memories. "It was beautiful there, you know. My husband and I, we had a good life. Our children were young, full of dreams. But then—" Her voice faltered, caught by the weight of the past. Thomas prompted gently. "The violence?" Evelyn nodded, a single tear escaping down her cheek. "It came so suddenly. One day we were planning our future, the next, we were running for our lives. My husband, he didn't make it. The office fell silent, the only sound the distant hum of New York traffic far below. Thomas leaned forward, his expression softening. I'm so sorry, Evelyn. I had no idea. She wiped her eyes quickly, embarrassed by her display of emotion. We came here with nothing. Just me and my 2 children. I thought America would be different, that my degrees and experience would matter. But without the right papers, without connections. She shrugged, a gesture of resignation. Cleaning was the only job I could find. Thomas stood up abruptly, walking to the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city. How long have you been working here, Evelyn? 3 years, sir. He turned back to face her, his expression unreadable. 3 years. And in all that time, no one bothered to ask about your background or skills? Evelyn gave a sad smile. People don't tend to see the cleaning staff, Mr. Blackwell. We're invisible. Something flashed in Thomas's eyes, regret, perhaps, or determination. He returned to his desk and pressed a button on his intercom. Janet, I need you to draw up some paperwork. We're creating a new position, assistant to the CEO. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. Surely he couldn't mean. Thomas turned to her, a genuine smile spreading across his face. Evelyn, I'd like to offer you a promotion. Your mathematical skills and attention to detail are exactly what this company needs. Of course, there will be a significant pay increase. Benefits. The works. Evelyn felt as if the floor had dropped out from beneath her. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to people like her. Mr. Blackwell, I don't know what to say. It's too much nonsense, Thomas said firmly. It's not nearly enough to make up for the oversight of the past 3 years, but it's a start. Tears welled up in Evelyn's eyes again, but this time they were tears of joy, disbelief, and hope reborn. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you so much. As Evelyn left the office that evening, her head spinning with the day's events, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to dream of a better future for herself and her children. But as she made her way home through the bustling streets of New York, a nagging voice in the back of her mind whispered a warning. Nothing in life comes without a price, and as she would soon learn, her newfound position would come with challenges she could never have anticipated. The subway ride to Brooklyn was a blur of emotions. Evelyn's mind raced with possibilities: a better apartment, good schools for Emma and Jack, maybe even a family vacation someday. But mixed with the excitement was a creeping anxiety. How would she navigate this new world of corporate politics? Would her coworkers accept her? And most pressing, how would she balance this new job with her responsibilities as a single mother? As she climbed the stairs to her small apartment, Evelyn took a deep breath, preparing for the conversation ahead. She opened the door to find Emma and Jack huddled over their homework at the kitchen table, just as she'd left them that morning. "Mom!" Jack exclaimed, jumping up to hug her. At 12, he was already almost as tall as she was. "You're home early!" Emma, 15 going on 30, looked up from her textbook with a mixture of relief and concern. "Is everything okay, Mom? Did something happen at work?" Evelyn set down her purse, a smile spreading across her face. "Kids, sit down. I have something important to tell you." As she recounted the day's events, watching her children's expressions change from confusion to disbelief to joy, Evelyn felt a surge of pride. This was why she had sacrificed so much, why she had worked endless hours at a job that made her invisible, for them, for their future. But even as they celebrated, ordering pizza as a rare treat and talking excitedly about the possibilities ahead, Evelyn couldn't shake a nagging feeling in the pit of her stomach. She thought of Thomas Blackwell's piercing gaze and the cutthroat world she had glimpsed in that conference room. As she tucked her children into bed that night, Evelyn made a silent vow. She would do whatever it took to succeed in this new role, to give her children the opportunities she had lost, but she would never forget who she was or where she came from. Little did Evelyn know, as she drifted off to sleep that night, that her vow would soon be put to the test in ways she could never have imagined. The line between right and wrong, between loyalty and integrity, was about to become blurred, and the choices she would face would have consequences that rippled far beyond the walls of Vanguard Enterprises. The stage was set for a journey that would challenge everything Evelyn thought she knew about herself, about the American dream, and about the true cost of success in a world where nothing is ever as it seems. The early morning sun glinted off the glass and steel facade of Vanguard Enterprises as Evelyn stepped out of the subway, her heart racing with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. Gone was the janitor's uniform, replaced by a modest but professional pantsuit she had splurged on over the weekend. As she walked through the revolving doors, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was an imposter in someone else's life. The security guard, who had barely glanced at her for the past 3 years, did a double-take as she approached. "Good morning, Mrs. Lewis," he said, his tone a mix of confusion and respect. "Mr. Blackwell left this for you." He handed her a sleek employee badge, the words executive assistant gleaming beneath her name. Evelyn's fingers trembled slightly as she clipped the badge to her lapel. The weight of it felt foreign, a physical reminder of how drastically her life had changed in just a few days. As she rode the elevator to the executive floor, Evelyn's mind wandered to the conversation she'd had with her children that morning. Emma had been thrilled, peppering her with questions about her new job and already making plans for the future. Jack, on the other hand, had been uncharacteristically quiet, his young face clouded with worry. "But who will be there when we get home from school?" he had asked, his voice small. The question had pierced Evelyn's heart. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, jolting Evelyn back to the present. She stepped out into a world of polished marble and hushed conversations, so different from the utilitarian hallways she had cleaned for years. "Evelyn, there you are!" Janet, Thomas's longtime secretary, bustled over. "Mr. Blackwell wants you in the morning briefing. Follow me quickly now." Before Evelyn could even set her purse down, she found herself swept into a large conference room. Executives in expensive suits lined the table, their expressions a mix of curiosity and skepticism as they regarded the newcomer. Thomas stood at the head of the table, his commanding presence filling the room. "Ah, Evelyn, glad you could join us. Everyone, this is Evelyn Lewis, our new executive assistant. She'll be working closely with me on some special projects." The room mumbled a half-hearted welcome, but Evelyn could feel the weight of their stares. She took a seat near the back, trying to make herself as inconspicuous as possible. As the meeting progressed, Evelyn found herself struggling to keep up with the rapid-fire discussions of mergers, acquisitions, and market projections. The numbers flew by in a dizzying array, far more complex than anything she had encountered in her academic career. Suddenly, Thomas's voice cut through her confusion. "Evelyn, what do you think about the Johnson merger? Does the math add up to you?" All eyes turned to her, and Evelyn felt a moment of panic. She hadn't even realized they were discussing a merger, but as she glanced at the figures projected on the screen, her old instincts kicked in. There was something off about the projections, a discrepancy that nagged at her mathematical sensibilities. Taking a deep breath, Evelyn spoke. "Mr. Blackwell, if I may. These projections seem overly optimistic. The growth rate doesn't align with the market trends we've been seeing in that sector." The room fell silent. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as she waited for the reaction. To her surprise, Thomas's face broke into a wide grin. "Exactly what I was thinking," he said, nodding approvingly. "This is why I brought Evelyn on board. People, fresh eyes, sharp mind. Let's take another look at those numbers." As the meeting continued, Evelyn felt a small surge of confidence. Maybe she could do this after all, but her sense of accomplishment was short-lived. As the day progressed, Evelyn found herself overwhelmed by the sheer volume of information she was expected to process. Confidential reports, hushed phone calls, coded emails. It seemed every corner of Vanguard Enterprises held a secret. Late in the afternoon, while organizing files in Thomas's office, a particular document caught her eye. It was a memo discussing Project Orion, filled with vague allusions to alternative revenue streams and regulatory workarounds. Something about the language set off alarm bells in Evelyn's mind. Just as she was about to look closer, Thomas's voice boomed from the doorway. "Evelyn, I need you to sit in on a call with our lawyers. Bring that Orion file with you." Evelyn jumped hastily, gathering the papers. As she followed Thomas out, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had stumbled upon something she wasn't supposed to see. The call was tense, filled with legal jargon that went over Evelyn's head, but she couldn't miss the underlying current of anxiety in the lawyers' voices, or the way Thomas's jaw clenched as they discussed potential exposure. As Evelyn left the office that evening, her mind was a whirlwind of confusion and unease. The glittering promise of her new position now seemed tarnished by the weight of unspoken secrets. On the subway ride home, Evelyn found herself questioning everything. What exactly had she gotten herself into? Was the security of this new job worth the moral ambiguity that seemed to come with it? She thought of her children waiting at home, of the dreams she had for their future, but for the first time, she wondered at what cost those dreams might come. As the train rumbled through the dark tunnels beneath the city, Evelyn made a decision. She would keep her eyes open, her wits sharp. Whatever secrets lurked in the shadows of Vanguard Enterprises, she would uncover them, and when the time came, she would have to make a choice that could change everything. Little did Evelyn know that moment of decision would come sooner than she could have ever imagined, and the consequences would reach far beyond the walls of her new corporate world. The weeks flew by in a whirlwind of meetings, reports, and late nights at the office. Evelyn found herself adapting to her new role with a mixture of determination and unease. Her mathematical skills proved invaluable, earning her grudging respect from her colleagues and effusive praise from Thomas. But with each passing day, the nagging feeling in her gut grew stronger. It was a crisp autumn evening when everything changed. The office was nearly empty, most employees having left hours ago. Evelyn sat at her desk poring over financial reports for an upcoming board meeting. The numbers weren't adding up, and a familiar sense of dread washed over her. As she dug deeper, cross-referencing documents and tracing money trails, a pattern began to emerge. Funds were being funneled through a maze of shell companies, obscuring their true destinations. It was subtle, masterfully hidden, but to Evelyn's trained eye, it was unmistakable. Her hands shook as she pulled up the file on Project Orion. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Vanguard Enterprises was engaged in large-scale fraud, cooking the books to inflate profits and deceive investors. Evelyn's mind raced. What should she do? Confront Thomas, go to the authorities? The weight of her dilemma pressed down on her, making it hard to breathe. Just then, Thomas's voice boomed from his office. "Evelyn, can you come in here for a moment?" Heart pounding, Evelyn gathered the incriminating documents and walked to his office. She found Thomas standing by the window, silhouetted against the New York skyline. "Ah, Evelyn," he said, turning to face her. "I wanted to discuss the board meeting tomorrow. Have you finished those reports?" Evelyn took a deep breath. It was now or never. "Mr. Blackwell, I've found some discrepancies in the financials." Thomas's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "What kind of discrepancies?" With trembling hands, Evelyn laid out the evidence she had uncovered. As she spoke, Thomas's face hardened, his jaw clenching tightly. When she finished, a heavy silence fell over the room. Evelyn's heart hammered in her chest as she waited for his response. Finally, Thomas spoke. "I see," he said, his voice unnervingly calm. "And what do you plan to do with this information?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with unspoken implications. Evelyn thought of her children, of the life she had begun to build. She thought of her past in Columbia, of the principles she had taught her students. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice cracking. "This is wrong." With trembling hands, Evelyn reached for her laptop. It was time to gather evidence and prepare for the storm that would come when she exposed the truth. But as she began to type, a new fear gripped her heart. What if Thomas had been right about the consequences of whistleblowing? What would happen to her family if she lost everything? Evelyn paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. The choice before her was impossible. continue living with the crushing weight of her silence, or risk everything to do what she knew was right. As the city began to wake outside her window, Evelyn took a deep breath and began to type. Whatever the consequences, she knew she had to reclaim her integrity for herself and for the example she wanted to set for her children. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with dangers she couldn't yet imagine. But for the first time in months, Evelyn felt a glimmer of hope. She was taking the first step toward reclaiming her soul and, with it, the mother her children deserved. Little did she know her decision would set in motion a chain of events that would shake Apex Industries to its core and force Evelyn to confront truths about herself and the world around her that she never could have anticipated. The fluorescent lights of Apex Industries buzzed overhead as Evelyn worked late into the night, her fingers flying across the keyboard. For weeks, she had been meticulously gathering evidence, documenting every instance of fraud she could find. The Prometheus files lay spread across her desk, a damning testament to the company's corruption. As she delved deeper into the labyrinth of financial deceit, Evelyn's heart raced. The scale of the fraud was staggering, reaching far beyond what she had initially uncovered. Government contracts, pension funds, even charitable organizations, all had been manipulated in Apex's relentless pursuit of profit. Just as she was about to call it a night, a file name caught her eye: Columbia Infrastructure Project 2010. With trembling hands, Evelyn opened the document, a sense of foreboding washing over her as she read. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The project detailed a series of construction contracts in Colombia, contracts that had been mired in controversy and allegations of corruption. Contracts that Evelyn realized with growing horror were linked to the violence that had torn her family apart and forced her to flee her homeland. And there, at the bottom of the document, was Thomas Maxwell's signature. Evelyn's vision blurred as the pieces fell into place. The negligent decision that had led to her husband's death, the corrupt officials who had threatened her family. It all led back to Apex Industries, to Thomas. She stumbled to the bathroom, barely making it to the sink before she was violently ill. As she splashed cold water on her face, Evelyn stared at her reflection, hardly recognizing the woman looking back at her. How had she become complicit in the very system that had destroyed her previous life? As dawn broke over the New York skyline, Evelyn made her decision. She couldn't just expose the fraud. She had to confront Thomas directly. He needed to face the human cost of his actions. With steely resolve, Evelyn marched to Thomas's office, clutching the damning evidence. She found him at his desk, looking haggard and worn. "Evelyn," he said, surprise evident in his voice. "What are you doing here so early?" "I know everything, Mr. Maxwell," Evelyn said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "About the fraud, about Columbia, about my husband." Thomas's face drained of color. "Evelyn, I don't know what you think you've found, but—" "Don't lie to me." Evelyn's voice rose, years of pain and anger bubbling to the surface. "Your company's actions in Colombia led to my husband's death. They forced me to flee my home, to abandon my career. And now I find myself complicit in the same corrupt system that destroyed my life." She laid the documents on his desk, her eyes never leaving his face. "I've gathered evidence of all of Apex's illegal activities. I'm prepared to go to the authorities, to the press, to anyone who will listen." Thomas slumped in his chair, the weight of his actions finally seeming to hit him. "Evelyn, please, you don't understand. The things we've done, they were necessary for the company, for the economy." Evelyn's voice was ice. "Was it necessary to destroy lives, to force people from their homes, to create widows and orphans?" A heavy silence fell over the office. Thomas looked older than Evelyn had ever seen him, the carefully maintained facade of the powerful CEO crumbling before her eyes. "What do you want?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn took a deep breath. This was the moment she had been preparing for, the crossroads that would determine the course of her future and the futures of countless others affected by Apex's actions. "I want you to make it right," she said firmly. "All of it. We're going to come clean about everything, the fraud, the cover-ups, Columbia. You're going to use your considerable resources to help the people whose lives have been destroyed by Apex's actions. Thomas's eyes widened. Evelyn, that would mean the end of Apex Industries as we know it, yes, and possibly prison time for those responsible, including you and me. The magnitude of what she was proposing hung heavy in the air. Evelyn thought of her children, of the comfortable life she had built for them, but she also thought of the countless other children who had suffered because of Apex's actions, of her husband, whose death would go unavenged if she stayed silent. Why? Thomas asked, genuine confusion in his voice. Why risk everything? You could walk away now, pretend you never saw any of this, live comfortably for the rest of your life. Evelyn smiled sadly. Because it's the right thing to do. Because I want to be able to look my children in the eye and tell them that when it mattered most, I chose integrity over comfort, justice over self-interest. As the sun rose higher over Manhattan, casting long shadows across the office, Evelyn and Thomas began the painful process of unraveling years of deceit. It would be a long and difficult journey, one that would test Evelyn's resolve in ways she couldn't yet imagine. But as she looked out over the city, Evelyn felt a weight lift from her shoulders. For the first time in years, she felt truly free. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with her head held high, secure in the knowledge that she had reclaimed her soul. Little did Evelyn know her act of courage would have far-reaching consequences, not just for Apex Industries, but for the entire corporate landscape. The road ahead would be fraught with danger and uncertainty, but it would also offer unexpected opportunities for redemption, both for herself and for those she once considered her enemies. The true test of Evelyn's character was just beginning, and the choices she would make in the coming days would reshape not only her own life but the lives of countless others touched by the ripples of her decision. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity that left Evelyn feeling as though she were caught in the eye of a storm. The decision to come clean about Apex Industries' wrongdoings had set off a chain reaction that reverberated through the corporate world and beyond. Evelyn sat in a small conference room surrounded by a team of lawyers, federal investigators, and journalists. The air was thick with tension as she recounted her story for what felt like the 100th time. Her voice, once timid in these halls of power, now rang out clear and strong. "Are you certain about these allegations, Mrs. Martinez?" a stern-faced investigator asked, his pen poised over a thick notepad. Evelyn nodded, her resolve unwavering. Every word. As Evelyn presented her evidence, the atmosphere in the conference room was charged with tension. News of Apex's fraud had surged through Wall Street like a tidal wave, sending the company's stock into a nosedive. Longtime employees were seen leaving the building with their belongings in cardboard boxes, their expressions a mix of shock and resignation. Evelyn's own situation was precarious. True to her word, she had implicated herself in her testimony, admitting her initial silence and complicity. The future was uncertain, but the burden of secrets no longer weighed her down. A sudden commotion outside the room drew everyone's attention. Raised voices and hurried footsteps approached rapidly. The door burst open, and Thomas Maxwell entered, flanked by his legal team. "This interview is over," one of his lawyers announced. But Thomas raised a hand to silence him. "No," Thomas said, his voice carrying a weariness Evelyn had never heard before. "No more hiding. No more lies." The room fell silent as Thomas approached the table where Evelyn sat. For a moment, their eyes met, and an unspoken understanding passed between them. "I'd like to make a full confession," Thomas declared to the stunned room. "About everything, Columbia, the fraud, all of it." What followed was hours of intense testimony. Thomas laid bare the entire sordid history of Apex Industries, corroborating everything Evelyn had revealed and adding crucial details that filled in the gaps of the investigation. As the day wore on, Evelyn watched the man she had once feared and admired crumble before her eyes. The facade of the powerful CEO fell away, revealing a broken man grappling with the weight of his actions. When the investigators finally called for a break, Evelyn found herself alone with Thomas in the conference room. An uncomfortable silence stretched between them. "Why did you do it?" Evelyn asked softly, voicing the question that had haunted her for weeks. Thomas sighed heavily, suddenly looking every bit of his 65 years. I told myself it was for the greater good, that the end justified the means. But the truth is, I lost my way. I became so focused on success, on winning, that I forgot what really mattered. He looked up at Evelyn, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. I can never undo the harm I've caused, to you, to your family, to countless others. But your courage, your integrity, it woke something in me, something I thought I'd lost long ago. Evelyn felt a complex mix of emotions, anger, pity, and a strange sense of kinship with this fallen titan. It's not too late to make amends, she said quietly. That's why we're here, isn't it? To try and make things right. As they were called back for more questioning, Evelyn realized that this moment marked not just the end of Apex Industries, but the beginning of a long and difficult journey toward justice and healing. The days that followed were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, press conferences, and emotional reckonings. Evelyn found herself at the center of a media storm, hailed as a whistleblower and champion of corporate accountability. Yet, the personal cost was high. She was let go from Apex, her future in the corporate world uncertain. Whispers of potential legal consequences for her initial silence loomed, and the comfortable life she had built for her children seemed to be slipping away. One evening, as she sat with Maria and Carlos, explaining everything that had happened, Evelyn felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. I'm so proud of you, Mama, Maria said, her eyes shining with admiration. You taught us that doing the right thing isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. Carlos, who had been quiet throughout the ordeal, suddenly spoke up. Does this mean we have to move again? Go back to our old apartment? Evelyn pulled her children close, her heart swelling with love and determination. I don't know what the future holds, mi amor, but I promise you this. Whatever happens, we'll face it together, and we'll do it with our heads held high, knowing we stood for what's right. As the sun set over the city, casting a golden glow through their apartment window, Evelyn felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead would be difficult, but she had reclaimed her integrity, set an example for her children, and taken the first steps toward justice for all those harmed by corporate greed. The story of Evelyn Martinez and Apex Industries would go on to inspire a wave of corporate reform and renewed focus on ethical business practices. For Evelyn, the true victory was much more personal. She had found her voice, stood up for her principles, and in doing so, had begun to heal the wounds of her past. As she held her children close, Evelyn knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with courage, integrity, and the unshakable belief that one person's act of bravery could indeed change the world. 6 months had passed since the fall of Apex Industries. The New York winter had given way to a tentative spring, mirroring the slow rebirth Evelyn felt in her own life. She sat in a small hospital room, the steady beep of monitors providing a rhythmic backdrop to her thoughts. The toll of the past months had been immense. The stress of the investigation, coupled with years of suppressed trauma, had manifested in a series of debilitating panic attacks that had landed Evelyn in the hospital. But as she looked out the window at the budding trees in the hospital courtyard, she felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for years. A soft knock at the door drew her attention. Maria and Carlos entered, their faces a mixture of concern and love. Hi, Mama, Maria said, crossing the room to embrace her mother gently. How are you feeling today? Evelyn smiled, the expression coming more easily now. Better, mi amor. Much better. Carlos, now 14 and growing quickly, hung back slightly. We brought you something, he said, producing a small envelope from behind his back. Evelyn opened it with curiosity. Inside was a newspaper clipping. The headline read, Whistleblower Inspires New Corporate Accountability Act. Beneath it was a handwritten note, Your courage changed more than you know. Thank you. Tears welled in Evelyn's eyes as she recognized Thomas Maxwell's initials. The man was serving time now, but true to his word, he had dedicated his considerable resources to making amends. There's more, Maria said, her voice trembling with excitement. She pulled out a letter from her bag. I got accepted to Columbia University, full scholarship. Evelyn's heart swelled with pride and gratitude. Despite everything they had been through, her children were thriving. The sacrifices and hard choices had all led to this moment. As they sat together talking about the future, a nurse entered the room. "Mrs. Martinez, you have a visitor." To Evelyn's surprise, Janet, Maxwell's former secretary, walked in. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but she managed a small smile. "Evelyn," Janet said, "I hope I'm not intruding. I wanted to thank you. What you did didn't just bring down Apex. It exposed similar practices across the industry. People like me who suspected things weren't right but were too afraid to speak up. Your bravery gave us courage." Evelyn reached out and squeezed Janet's hand. "We all have the power to make a difference," she said softly. "Sometimes we just need a reminder of who we really are." As Janet left, Evelyn turned to her children. "You know," she said, "when I first came to this country, I thought the American dream was about success, money, power. But now I understand it's about the freedom to stand up for what's right and to make a difference in the world." Maria nodded, her eyes shining. "And to pass those values on to the next generation." The conversation was interrupted by another knock. A man in a suit entered, introducing himself as a representative from a nonprofit focused on corporate ethics. "Mrs. Martinez," he said, "we've been following your story closely. We were wondering if you'd be interested in joining our team as a consultant and speaker. Your experience could help prevent others from falling into the same traps." Evelyn felt a surge of hope. Here was a chance to turn her painful experience into something positive, and to continue making a difference. As the day wore on and visitors came and went, Evelyn reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point, from a frightened immigrant to a corporate climber to a whistleblower. Each step had taught her valuable lessons about integrity, courage, and the true meaning of success. That evening, as she sat with her children watching the sunset from her hospital window, Evelyn received one final visitor. It was her doctor bearing news that she was well enough to go home. As they packed up her things, Evelyn paused, looking at her reflection in the window. The woman who looked back at her was older, wiser, battle-worn, but undefeated. She had reclaimed not just her integrity, but her very sense of self. "Ready to go home?" Maria asked, offering her arm for support. Evelyn smiled, embracing her children. "Yes," she said, her voice filled with quiet determination. "Ready for whatever comes next." As they walked out of the hospital into the cool spring evening, Evelyn felt a sense of possibility she hadn't experienced since her youth in Colombia. The road ahead was uncertain, but she faced it with courage, integrity, and the love of her family. The story of Evelyn Martinez, immigrant, mother, whistleblower, would go on to inspire countless others. For Evelyn, the greatest victory was the knowledge that she had stayed true to her values and set an example.